It began like any other rumor in the sleepy coastal town of Santander, nestled along Spain's northern shores, a hushed whisper that rippled through the tightly knit community. But this time, the rumor wasn't about stolen glances or the usual petty grievances of small-town life. This time, it was about a mansion perched high above the Bay of Biscay, a symbol of wealth and success, now forever tainted by the unspeakable tragedy that had occurred within its walls. The bodies were found in the opulent villa owned by Oliver Beckett, a 50-year-old real estate mogul, and his wife Jessica Rivers, a 32-year-old architect known for her groundbreaking designs. The villa, with its stunning views of the ocean, was the envy of many, a place where wealth, beauty, and power converged. But behind the grand facade lay a story darker than anyone could have imagined. Jessica's life, on the surface, was perfect. She had traded the high-stakes corporate world of Madrid for a more peaceful life in Santander, and in doing so, had found the life she thought she wanted. She was married to a man of influence, lived in a mansion that most people could only dream of, and was respected for her work in architecture. But despite the outward appearance, something sinister lurked beneath. Her life took a sharp turn the moment she met Oliver Beckett. They had crossed paths at an art gallery in Santander, both drawn to a painting that neither could fully understand. He had approached her, charming in his way, a man of quiet confidence and power. His salt and pepper hair, sharp suits, and intensity pulled her in. Oliver represented everything Jessica thought she needed, a way out of the stress and chaos of her old life in Madrid. Their romance unfolded in a whirlwind of luxury, yachts, and private dinners within months. Oliver had proposed, sweeping Jessica into a world of unimaginable wealth. They married quickly in a private ceremony. The event kept quiet from the prying eyes of the local gossip mongers, but there were whispers from the start about their age difference, about Oliver's controlling nature, and about Jessica's ambition that didn't seem to match her role as the perfect wife. But for Jessica, those whispers were easy to ignore. For a while, she enjoyed the lavish lifestyle, the sense of stability she had craved. Yet, like most things too good to be true, the cracks in their perfect life began to show almost immediately after the wedding. Oliver's charm had always been wrapped in a layer of control, but now that control began to tighten. He questioned her every move, criticized her career choices, and eventually persuaded her to leave behind her work to focus solely on being his wife. Jessica, who once thrived in her professional life, was now reduced to a trophy in the villa, a beautiful ornament to complement Oliver's success. But it wasn't until Lucas Beckett, Oliver's son from his first marriage, returned to Santander that things truly began to spiral out of control. Lucas was 22, restless and rebellious, a young man who had spent most of his life in his father's shadow, trying and failing to carve out his own identity. He had been living abroad for the past few years, bouncing between art projects and odd jobs. His arrival in Santander that summer was sudden and unexpected. Jessica remembered meeting Lucas briefly at her wedding, a withdrawn, sullen teenager who seemed uninterested in the spectacle around him. But now, as a man, Lucas was different. His presence in the house disrupted the tense but predictable dynamic between Jessica and Oliver. The relationship between father and son was strained, fraught with years of unresolved resentment. Oliver was deeply disappointed in Lucas's failure to follow in his footsteps, while Lucas harbored bitterness for the father who had been more focused on his business than his family. Jessica, already feeling trapped and isolated, was drawn to Lucas in ways she hadn't anticipated. He was everything Oliver wasn't: passionate, artistic, and most importantly, free. There was something about his reckless spirit that appealed to her, reminding her of the ambition and independence she had once cherished. They began talking more frequently, bonding over their shared frustrations with Oliver's overbearing control. Their conversations, once casual, became longer and more intimate. And in those moments, Jessica found herself opening up in ways she never could with her husband. One night, beneath the dim light of the garden's olive trees, everything changed. It had started as another conversation, Lucas venting about his father's latest outburst, Jessica offering quiet comfort. But the air between them had shifted. Lucas, in a moment of vulnerability, admitted how abandoned he had always felt, how he had never truly felt like part of Oliver's life. Jessica placed a hand on his shoulder, meaning only to comfort him, but their eyes met in a way that felt inevitable. And then, without thinking, they kissed, desperately, recklessly, as though their connection had been building to this moment all along. What started as a kiss soon blossomed into an affair. They met in secret, hiding from Oliver's ever-watchful gaze. Their rendezvous became more frequent, more dangerous. In the quiet corners of the villa, in the shadowed corridors, they stole moments together, consumed by their growing passion. Jessica knew it was wrong, knew that they were playing a dangerous game, but the pull between them was undeniable. She was intoxicated by the freedom Lucas represented, and Lucas, for all his complicated feelings about his father, was equally drawn to the forbidden nature of their relationship. But secrets, especially ones this dangerous, don't stay hidden for long. Oliver began to notice the subtle changes in Jessica's behavior. The way she glanced at Lucas, the way she seemed distant when they were alone. He wasn't a fool. He had built an empire by reading people, and he could tell when something was off. At first, he dismissed it, chalking it up to stress, or perhaps his own paranoia. But as the months wore on, his suspicions grew, and with those suspicions came a darker side of Oliver, one that Jessica hadn't fully seen before. The once charming man became cold and calculating. He began tracking Jessica's movements, questioning her about every detail of her day, and growing increasingly agitated when her answers didn't align with his expectations. The tension in the house was unbearable, and Jessica knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. And then, one night, it did. Oliver had been drinking heavily that evening. He had returned home late, and Jessica, anxious and guilty, had retreated to her room. Lucas, unaware of the danger, had stayed in the greenhouse, one of the few places in the villa where he felt he could be himself. The air was thick with anticipation, as though the villa itself was holding its breath. Jessica was restless, her mind racing with thoughts of what might happen if Oliver discovered their affair. She decided to go to the greenhouse, needing to see Lucas, needing to escape the suffocating weight of her guilt. But as she approached, she saw him first, Oliver, standing in the shadows, watching Lucas through the glass. His face was twisted with fury, his hands clenched into fists. Before Jessica could stop him, Oliver stormed into the greenhouse. The confrontation that followed was brutal. Oliver, in a rage unlike anything Jessica had ever seen, lunged at Lucas. The younger man tried to defend himself, but Oliver's fury was overwhelming. Fists flew, and the sound of glass shattering filled the air. Jessica screamed, but her voice was lost in the chaos. And then, it happened. A sickening crack. Oliver had struck Lucas with something heavy. Jessica couldn't even tell what it was. All she knew was that Lucas crumpled to the ground, his head hitting the stone floor with a dull thud. Blood pooled beneath him, and in that moment, everything went still. Jessica stood frozen, her mind unable to process what had just occurred. Oliver, breathing heavily, stood over his son's body, his face a mask of horror and disbelief. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, both of them realizing the gravity of what had just happened. There was no turning back. What followed was a blur. Oliver, in a desperate attempt to cover his tracks, dragged Lucas's body to the cellar. Jessica, paralyzed by shock, did nothing to stop him. She couldn't. The guilt and fear had rendered her useless. But the truth, as it always does, had a way of surfacing. The investigation into Lucas's disappearance began almost immediately. Friends and acquaintances in town noticed his sudden absence, and it wasn't long before the police arrived at the villa. Oliver, ever the businessman, played his part well, acting the concerned father, worried about his son's whereabouts. But Jessica's nerves were frayed. Every question from the detectives felt like a knife twisting deeper into her conscience. The days turned into weeks, and the pressure mounted. Jessica's life became a waking nightmare. The villa's luxurious halls now a prison of guilt and fear. She knew the truth would come out eventually. It had to. And when it did, there would be no escaping the consequences. As the days passed, Jessica's world became a delicate house of cards, teetering on the brink of collapse. Oliver had buried the evidence of Lucas's death in the cellar, and though the police had yet to find the body, the weight of their deception hung over them like a dark cloud. The villa sat in grim silence, its once grand halls now filled with an air of foreboding. Jessica stood in the dim light of her bedroom, staring at the man she once thought would be her salvation. Oliver Beckett was passed out in the armchair by the window, an empty glass of scotch dangling from his hand. His chest rose and fell with the slow, heavy breaths of a man who had drunk far too much, as had become his nightly routine. The weight of everything, the lies, the secrets, and the affair, pressed down on her like a suffocating blanket. Jessica had once dreamed of escaping her high-pressure life in Madrid by marrying Oliver. She had thought that life in the luxurious villa overlooking the Bay of Biscay would be a dream, that the wealth and comfort would grant her freedom. But now, as she watched her husband, this controlling, possessive man who had robbed her of her independence, she realized that the only true way out of her prison was through a far darker door than she had ever imagined. The guilt of Lucas's death, buried deep within the cellar of her mind, had festered, feeding off her fear. But Oliver's recent behavior, his paranoia, and his violent outbursts had pushed her past the point of guilt. Every night he drank more heavily. Every day he questioned her movements, lashed out in suspicion, demanding answers to questions she could no longer keep straight in her head. She knew the truth would surface sooner or later. Oliver had become reckless. The guilt from killing his son, Lucas, who had discovered the affair between him and Jessica, was eating him alive. But rather than confess or confront the truth, Oliver buried it deeper, turning to the bottle. Jessica watched as his mental state deteriorated, his fits of rage becoming more dangerous, his accusations more erratic. That night, as the storm outside lashed at the windows of the villa, Jessica made a decision. She could no longer live under Oliver's control, nor could she risk him unraveling everything. The truth about Lucas's death, about the affair, about everything, would destroy them both if it came out. She needed to protect herself, and the only way to do that was to ensure that Oliver could never speak again. But this time, Jessica didn't want to make it look like an accident. The time for subtlety was over. Oliver had pushed her too far, and she wanted to end it decisively. Her plan was cold, calculated. The storm was raging outside, drowning out any noise that might escape the villa. She waited, her heart pounding as she listened to the sound of the wind howling and the rain slashing against the windows. Oliver had a gun. He always did. He kept it locked in the drawer of his bedside table, an item he had once said was for protection. Now, it would serve a very different purpose. Jessica had seen him pull it out on nights when his paranoia got the best of him, when he imagined enemies lurking in the shadows. Tonight, she would use it. She moved silently across the room, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, and retrieved the gun from the drawer. Her fingers trembled as she wrapped them around the cold metal, but she didn't hesitate. Not anymore. The decision had been made long before this moment. The gun felt heavy in her hands, a symbol of all the power that had been taken from her. Now, she would take it back. Oliver stirred in his chair, mumbling in his drunken haze, unaware of the danger standing just a few feet away. He shifted slightly, his eyes fluttering open for a brief moment before closing again. Jessica's heart pounded in her chest as she raised the gun, her hands steady despite the surge of adrenaline coursing through her veins. She aimed at his chest, her breath catching in her throat as her finger tightened around the trigger. The storm outside roared, a final warning from the world, as if daring her to follow through with what she had planned. And then, with a single sharp movement, she squeezed the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the room, louder than she had expected. The force of the shot jerked Oliver upright in his chair for a split second, his eyes wide with shock and confusion. Blood blossomed across his chest, staining his shirt in a dark crimson. He gasped, a wet, choking sound escaping his lips, and then slumped forward, the glass slipping from his hand and shattering on the floor. Jessica stood frozen, her breath shallow and ragged, the gun still raised. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt, and the world spun around her as the reality of what she had done settled in. She had killed him. Oliver was dead, slumped over in the chair, his body lifeless and still. She had freed herself from his control, but in doing so, she had crossed a line from which there was no return. Jessica knew she had to act quickly. The storm would have masked the sound of the gunshot, but she couldn't leave any evidence that would tie her directly to the crime. Her mind raced as she wiped her fingerprints from the gun and placed it in Oliver's limp hand, arranging the scene to make it look like a suicide. The narrative she would tell the police was already forming in her mind. Oliver had been drinking heavily, consumed by guilt over Lucas's disappearance. His erratic behavior had been escalating for weeks, and finally, in a moment of despair, he had taken his own life. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the villa drenched in an eerie calm. Jessica made the call, her voice trembling as she reported her husband's death. Within hours, the villa was swarming with police, and Detective Ruiz was among them, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the scene. Ruiz moved through the villa with the careful precision of a man who knew there was more to discover. His questions were calm, methodical, but Jessica could feel the weight of his suspicions pressing down on her. He asked about the events of the previous night, about Oliver's drinking habits, about their relationship. Jessica answered carefully, sticking to the story she had rehearsed in her mind. Oliver had been drinking heavily, she explained. He had been depressed, erratic. She found him in the morning, slumped in the chair, the gun in his hand. It was a tragic suicide, but Ruiz's sharp gaze lingered on her longer than she liked. He moved through the house, observing the details that no one else would have noticed. The overturned glass, the slightly askew furniture, the faint scent of cleaning supplies. He was looking for something, and Jessica knew that he would find it if she wasn't careful. As the investigation into Oliver's death began, Ruiz's focus shifted. He wasn't just interested in the events of the previous night. He was interested in the larger story, the one that connected Oliver's death to the disappearance of Lucas Beckett. Ruiz had always suspected that something more sinister had happened to Lucas, and now, with Oliver gone, he had the opportunity to dig deeper. Ruiz returned to the villa over the following days, his presence becoming a fixture in Jessica's life. He was polite, almost friendly, but Jessica could feel the weight of his scrutiny in every conversation. He asked about Lucas, about the relationship between father and son, about the tension that had always simmered beneath the surface. He brought up Lucas's disappearance casually, as if it were an afterthought, but Jessica could see the gears turning in his mind. As the days passed, Ruiz began to uncover the threads that linked Oliver's death to Lucas's. He discovered financial irregularities in Oliver's accounts, large sums of money that had been funneled into offshore accounts just before Lucas's disappearance. He found old emails between Lucas and a mysterious figure, discussing a blackmail scheme that Lucas had been involved in. The more Ruiz uncovered, the more it became clear that Lucas had been involved in something far more dangerous than anyone had realized. But the most shocking discovery came when Ruiz uncovered a set of surveillance tapes from the villa, tapes that Oliver had installed in secret. The footage showed Jessica and Lucas together in the greenhouse on the night of his death, their bodies entwined in a moment of passion that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. The affair, which had been hidden for so long, was now laid bare. Ruiz watched the footage in silence, his face betraying nothing, but inside, he knew he had found the missing piece of the puzzle. Lucas's death had not been an accident. It had been the result of a violent confrontation between father and son, a confrontation that had ended with Lucas dead and Oliver covering up the crime. And now, with Oliver dead as well, the truth was finally beginning to surface. Ruiz returned to the villa one final time, armed with the evidence he needed to confront Jessica. As he stood in the grand entryway, looking up at the woman who had once seemed so untouchable, he realized that the story was far more twisted than he had ever imagined. Jessica, standing at the top of the stairs, felt the weight of the detective's gaze. She knew that the game was over. The secrets she had buried, the lies she had told, had all led to this moment. And as she descended the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest, she wondered if she had ever truly been in control at all. The investigation was far from over, but one thing was clear. Jessica Beckett's perfect life had been built on a foundation of lies. And now, as the truth began to unravel, she would have to face the consequences of her actions. And as Detective Ruiz led her away, the villa stood in silence once more, its walls heavy with the weight of the secrets it had witnessed. As the days stretched on, the whispers in Santander grew louder. Jessica had done everything she could to maintain the image of a grieving widow, but the town's eyes were on her, and she could feel it. The weight of her secrets seemed to seep into every aspect of her life. Her once perfect facade, now crumbling under the scrutiny of both the townspeople and Detective Ruiz. Detective Manuel Ruiz was relentless. He had been patient with his investigation, quietly gathering pieces of evidence that would reveal the truth about Oliver Beckett's death. Jessica's claim that Oliver had committed suicide didn't sit right with him. There were too many loose ends, too many inconsistencies in her story. And most importantly, there was Lucas, still missing, still haunting the investigation with his absence. Ruiz's mind had been occupied with thoughts of the family dynamics within the Beckett household. Oliver had been a domineering man, controlling every aspect of his wife's and son's lives. Lucas had been a wild card, restless, troubled, and ultimately in over his head with something far more dangerous than youthful rebellion. Jessica, meanwhile, was the enigmatic figure at the center of it all, seemingly fragile and trapped. Yet Ruiz could see there was something more beneath her surface. The investigation into Lucas's disappearance had stalled after Oliver's death, but now Ruiz had a renewed sense of purpose. His discovery of the surveillance footage showing Jessica and Lucas's affair was the breakthrough he had been waiting for. It painted a clearer picture of the tension in the house, of the secrets that had been festering for months. But it also raised new questions, questions that Ruiz was determined to answer. As he sifted through the evidence, Ruiz's instincts told him that Oliver's death and Lucas's disappearance were inextricably linked. The footage suggested that Lucas had been more involved in his father's life than anyone had realized. The emails between Lucas and an unknown figure hinted at blackmail, and Oliver's financial records showed large sums of money disappearing into offshore accounts. But the biggest question remained: where was Lucas's body? Ruiz was convinced that Lucas had been murdered and that Oliver had covered it up. But what he couldn't yet prove was Jessica's role in it all. Had she been a victim, swept up in the chaos of her husband's and stepson's feud? Or had she been complicit in Lucas's death, perhaps even orchestrating it in a desperate bid for control? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that Jessica was the key to unlocking the truth. The problem was, Jessica had grown increasingly guarded since Oliver's death. Her once polite responses to Ruiz's inquiries had become more clipped, more defensive. She rarely left the villa now, isolating herself behind its grand stone walls. Ruiz knew that time was running out. Jessica's silence was her way of fortifying her defense, and if he didn't act soon, she would slip through his grasp. One evening, Ruiz decided to pay Jessica an unexpected visit. The air outside was thick with the promise of rain, the sky heavy with dark clouds as he made his way up the long drive to the Beckett villa. The grand house loomed ahead of him, a silent sentinel over the turbulent waters of the Bay of Biscay. He had no appointment, but he knew Jessica wouldn't dare turn him away. When Jessica answered the door, she was clearly caught off guard. Her pale face and tired eyes betrayed the strain she had been under since Oliver's death. But there was something else in her expression, something that Ruiz hadn't noticed before. Fear. "Detective," Jessica said, her voice steady, but with an undercurrent of tension. "I wasn't expecting you." Ruiz offered a thin smile. "I know, but I have a few more questions, and I thought we could discuss them informally. I won't take much of your time." Jessica hesitated for a moment, but then nodded and stepped aside to let him in. Ruiz followed her into the drawing room, his eyes sweeping over the space with the practiced gaze of a man who had spent years reading the unspoken details of people's lives. The room was immaculate, but it felt cold and lifeless, as though the spirit of the house had been drained away, along with its occupants. "Would you like something to drink?" Jessica asked, already moving toward the bar. "No, thank you," Ruiz replied, his eyes never leaving her. "I'd rather get straight to the point." Jessica froze for a split second, but quickly recovered, turning back to face him. "Of course," she said, her voice soft but guarded. "What do you need to know?" Ruiz took a seat, gesturing for her to do the same. "I've been looking deeper into the circumstances surrounding your husband's death," he began, watching her carefully for any sign of a reaction. "And I've uncovered some new information about Lucas." At the mention of her stepson's name, Jessica's expression hardened. "I've already told you everything I know about Lucas," she said, her voice sharp. "He left. I don't know where he went." Ruiz leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "I don't believe that's true, Mrs. Beckett. In fact, I think you know exactly what happened to Lucas." Jessica's breath hitched, but she quickly composed herself. "Detective, I don't know what you're implying, but—" "I'm not implying anything," Ruiz interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "I'm stating a fact. I've seen the surveillance footage from the night Lucas disappeared." Jessica's face drained of color, her hands gripping the armrest of her chair. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Ruiz waited, letting the silence hang in the air, knowing that it was only a matter of time before she cracked. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jessica finally managed, but her voice wavered. Ruiz leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "You don't need to lie to me, Jessica. I know about your affair with Lucas. I know that Oliver found out about it, and I know that there was a confrontation that night. What I don't know is what happened after that. But I have a feeling you're about to tell me." Jessica's heart raced, her mind scrambling for a way out. She had been so careful, so meticulous in covering her tracks, but now it seemed that everything was unraveling. She could feel Ruiz's gaze boring into her, and the weight of his accusations pressed down on her like a vice. "I didn't kill Lucas," Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible. Ruiz raised an eyebrow. "Then who did?" For a moment, Jessica was silent, her mind racing as she tried to decide what to say. She knew that the truth would destroy her, but lying would only delay the inevitable. Ruiz had already uncovered too much. There was no escaping it now. "It was Oliver," she said finally, her voice trembling. "He found out about the affair and he lost control. Lucas tried to defend himself, but Oliver, he killed him." Ruiz's expression didn't change, but inside, he felt a sense of grim satisfaction. He had suspected as much, but hearing it from Jessica's lips was the confirmation he needed. Still, there were more questions to be answered. "And what did you do, Jessica?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Did you help Oliver cover it up?" Jessica's eyes filled with tears as she nodded. "I didn't have a choice," she said, her voice breaking. "He threatened me. He said that if I didn't help him, he would make sure I went down for it too." Ruiz watched her carefully, his mind working through the details. It made sense, but there was still something missing. Jessica was holding something back, something crucial. "What about Oliver's death?" Ruiz asked, his voice quiet but insistent. "Was that really a suicide, or was it something else?" Jessica looked away, her hands trembling in her lap. She knew this was the moment of truth, the moment when everything would come crashing down. But she couldn't keep lying, not anymore. "I killed him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I shot him." Ruiz felt a surge of adrenaline at her confession, but he kept his expression neutral. "Why?" Jessica wiped away a tear, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Because he was going to kill me." He was unraveling, losing control. After Lucas died, he became paranoid, violent. "I knew that if I didn't stop him, he would kill me, just like he killed Lucas." Ruiz nodded slowly, his mind piecing together the final parts of the puzzle. Jessica's story made sense, but it was clear that she had only revealed the truth because she had no other choice. Now, with both father and son dead, the tragic tale of the Beckett family was finally coming to light. The following days were a blur of police reports, interviews, and media attention. Jessica was taken into custody, charged with Oliver's murder and accessory to Lucas's death. The town of Santander was rocked by the revelations, the once gossiped rumors now confirmed as horrific truths. The Beckett villa, once a symbol of wealth and power, stood empty and silent, its walls echoing with the weight of the secrets it had held for so long. Detective Ruiz, though satisfied with the outcome, couldn't shake the feeling that the full truth had still eluded him. There weren't too many layers to the story, too many unanswered questions, but for now, he had what he needed. As Jessica sat in her prison cell, the reality of her situation finally sinking in, she couldn't help but wonder if things could have been different. If she had made different choices, if she hadn't gotten involved with Lucas, if she had found a way to escape Oliver sooner. But now, it was too late. The weight of her decisions had sealed her fate, and there was no going back. And as the rain began to fall once more over Santander, the truth of what had happened in the Beckett villa would continue to haunt the town for years to come. The quiet streets of Santander, once filled with whispers about the Beckett family's glamorous lifestyle, were now abuzz with speculation about the gruesome truth that had emerged from behind the villa's walls. The media had descended on the town, eager to cover every detail of the unfolding scandal. News outlets painted Jessica as the calculating femme fatale who had seduced both father and son, leading to the tragic deaths of both men. The headlines were sensational, feeding the public's hunger for drama and intrigue. Detective Manuel Ruiz, however, wasn't interested in the tabloid headlines. For him, the case was far from over. Despite Jessica's confession, something still nagged at him. Her story, while believable, left too many unanswered questions. It felt too neat, too convenient. Ruiz had spent years untangling complex cases, and his gut told him there was more to this one than met the eye. The night after Jessica's arrest, Ruiz sat in his dimly lit office, going over the case files once more. The evidence was damning. The surveillance footage of Jessica and Lucas's affair, the financial records that linked Lucas to blackmail, the bloodstains that matched Lucas's DNA, and Jessica's confession of shooting Oliver. But something about the timeline didn't add up. The detective leaned back in his chair, staring at the corkboard, where he had pinned various pieces of evidence. Pictures of the Beckett family were tacked in the center, with threads linking them to other documents. Financial records, photographs from the crime scene, and the surveillance stills of Lucas and Jessica together in the greenhouse. But there was one photo Ruiz kept coming back to, an old family portrait of Oliver, Lucas, and Oliver's first wife, Isabel. Isabel Beckett had died under mysterious circumstances years earlier, long before Jessica had entered the picture. Her death had been ruled an accident, a tragic fall down the stairs at the villa. But Ruiz had always felt uneasy about it. He had been a junior officer when the case was first investigated, and he remembered thinking at the time that there were too many loose ends. But Oliver's power and influence had been enough to bury any further investigation. Now, with Oliver dead and Lucas gone, Ruiz wondered if Isabel's death had been part of a much larger story. What if Isabel's death wasn't an accident? What if it had been the first crack in the foundation of the Beckett family? A crack that had only widened over the years, eventually swallowing them all? The next morning, Ruiz made a decision. He would reopen the investigation into Isabel's death. If there was any connection between her death and the events that had unfolded with Lucas and Oliver, he was determined to find it. Ruiz started by visiting the old villa, which now stood abandoned. The police had already sealed off the property, but with the case still open, he had access. As he walked through the grand but decaying halls, he felt the weight of history pressing down on him. The house was a mausoleum, not just for the Beckett family, but for the secrets it had kept hidden for so many years. In the stairwell where Isabel had supposedly fallen, Ruiz examined the old stone steps. There were still faint scratches in the banister where her hand had supposedly caught as she fell, and the scene played out in his mind. According to the original investigation, Isabel had been home alone when the accident occurred, but that detail bothered Ruiz. If she had been alone, why were there inconsistencies in the pattern of the bloodstains? And why had no one looked further into the fact that Isabel had been in the middle of a bitter divorce with Oliver? Ruiz spent hours combing through the house, looking for anything that might give him a clue. He knew it was a long shot. Years had passed, and whatever evidence might have been there had long since been cleaned away. But something in the house felt off, as if the walls themselves were holding on to their secrets, waiting for someone to pry them loose. As Ruiz moved through the villa, he noticed something strange in Oliver's old study. The room was mostly empty now, but in the corner, behind an old bookshelf, he found a hidden compartment. Inside was a stack of old journals, Oliver's journals. Ruiz sat down at the desk, flipping through the pages, his heart pounding as he realized what he was holding. The journals detailed Oliver's rise to power, his business dealings, and his personal life. But as Ruiz read further, the entries grew darker. Oliver wrote about his frustrations with Lucas, about how he had tried to mold him into his own image, but had failed. He wrote about Jessica, about his suspicions of her relationship with Lucas, and about his increasing paranoia. But what caught Ruiz's attention most was the journal entry about Isabel's death. Oliver had written in chilling detail about the night she died, not as a grieving husband, but as a man who had planned every step. Isabel had discovered something about Oliver's business, something that would have destroyed him if it had come to light. She had threatened to go public with the information, and Oliver had taken matters into his own hands. He had pushed her down the stairs, making sure to leave just enough ambiguity in the scene to make it look like an accident. Ruiz felt a cold chill run down his spine. Isabel's death hadn't been an accident. It had been murder, carefully orchestrated by Oliver. And if Oliver had been willing to kill his first wife to protect his empire, what else had he been capable of? The revelation about Isabel's death added a new layer to the case. Ruiz realized that the Beckett family's secrets ran much deeper than he had imagined. Oliver had been a man driven by power and control, willing to do whatever it took to protect his reputation. Lucas had likely known this about his father, which would explain his attempts to blackmail him. And Jessica, caught in the middle of it all, had been left to pick up the pieces of a shattered family. Armed with this new information, Ruiz confronted Jessica once again. She had already confessed to killing Oliver, but now Ruiz wanted to know the full truth about what had happened to Lucas. Sitting across from her, in the sterile interrogation room, Ruiz laid the journals on the table between them. Jessica stared at the journals, her face pale. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's Oliver's," Ruiz said, his tone steady. "He wrote about everything, about Isabel, about you, about Lucas. He thought he could keep all of his secrets hidden, but he was wrong. I know he killed Isabel, and now I need you to tell me the rest of the story. What really happened to Lucas?" Jessica closed her eyes, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she whispered. "I didn't know what Oliver was capable of when I married him. I thought I could escape, that I could have a new life with Lucas. But Oliver, he always knew." Ruiz leaned forward, his voice gentle but insistent. "Tell me, Jessica. Tell me what happened that night." And so, Jessica began to unravel the truth. She told Ruiz about the night of the confrontation, the night Oliver had found out about the affair. Lucas had come to her, panicked, telling her that Oliver had discovered their secret. They had planned to leave together, to start over somewhere far away from Santander. But Oliver had confronted them in the greenhouse. There had been a fight. Lucas had tried to defend himself, but Oliver had overpowered him. In the heat of the moment, Oliver had killed Lucas, striking him down in a fit of rage. Jessica, terrified and in shock, had helped Oliver hide the body, knowing that if anyone found out, she would be implicated as well. But the guilt had eaten away at her, and when Oliver's paranoia grew out of control, she had taken matters into her own hands. She had shot him to protect herself, knowing that he would never stop until she was dead too. Ruiz listened carefully, piecing together the final parts of the puzzle. Jessica's story, while tragic, made sense. She had been trapped in a web of lies and manipulation, caught between a man who had killed to protect his secrets and a son who had tried to escape his father's control. The case was finally coming to a close. But for Ruiz, the weight of the truth was heavy. The Beckett family had been destroyed from the inside, their secrets tearing them apart. And now, with Jessica behind bars and the villa standing empty, the only thing left was the haunting legacy of a family built on lies. The grand courtroom in Santander was filled with a tense silence as the trial of Jessica Beckett began. The once celebrated architect, whose life had spiraled into a web of deceit, murder, and betrayal, now sat at the defendant's table, her pale hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollowed from months of incarceration and reflection. The town had watched with morbid fascination as the details of the Beckett family's downfall unraveled in the media. But now they would witness the final act, the trial that would determine Jessica's fate. The prosecution had built a solid case against her. They painted her as a manipulative woman who had used her charm to seduce her stepson, and then, in a desperate bid for control, murdered her husband to cover up her crimes. The evidence was damning. The surveillance footage of her affair with Lucas, the financial irregularities linked to Lucas's blackmail scheme, and of course, her confession to killing Oliver. But the defense, led by an experienced attorney, sought to paint a different picture. They argued that Jessica had been a victim, first of Oliver's controlling nature and later of his escalating violence. They claimed that her actions were those of a woman pushed to the edge, a woman who had been forced to protect herself in a moment of terror. They pointed to Oliver's history of manipulation, his role in Isabel's death, and his violent outbursts as proof that Jessica had been living in constant fear for her life. As the trial progressed, it became clear that this was not just about the events leading up to Oliver's death, but about the entire Beckett family's history, about power, control, and the lies that had festered behind the walls of their villa for years. The prosecution sought to hold Jessica accountable for the deaths of both Oliver and Lucas, while the defense argued that she had been a pawn in a much larger game, a game orchestrated by Oliver himself. Jessica sat quietly through most of the proceedings, her eyes downcast, her expression unreadable. She had been advised to remain as composed as possible, but inside, she felt as though she was unraveling. The weight of her decisions, the guilt of what she had done, bore down on her with every passing day. She knew that no matter what the outcome of the trial, she would never escape the consequences of her actions. The prosecution's closing argument was damning. They presented Jessica as a cold, calculating woman who had carefully plotted the deaths of both Lucas and Oliver to secure her freedom. They pointed to her confession, the way she had shot Oliver in cold blood, and the lengths she had gone to in order to cover up the truth. This was not a crime of passion, the prosecutor argued. This was premeditated. She wanted them both gone, and she made it happen. When the defense presented their closing argument, they focused on Jessica's role as a victim. They detailed the years of emotional abuse she had suffered at the hands of Oliver, the way he had isolated her from her career, from her friends, from the world. They argued that when she killed Oliver, she did so out of fear for her own life, not out of malice. She was trapped, her lawyer said. She had no choice. The jury deliberated for days, the weight of the case pressing down on them. The media swarmed the courthouse, and the town of Santander held its breath. Everyone had their opinions, their theories about what had truly happened inside the Beckett villa. Some believed Jessica was a victim, pushed to the brink by Oliver's cruelty. Others believed she was a calculating killer who had manipulated both father and son for her own gain. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the jury returned with their verdict. Jessica was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter in the death of Oliver Beckett and accessory to the murder of Lucas Beckett. The court acknowledged the mitigating circumstances, Oliver's history of abuse, and the psychological toll it had taken on Jessica. But they could not ignore the fact that she had pulled the trigger and taken a life. The judge, in his sentencing, expressed sympathy for the ordeal Jessica had endured, but made it clear that the law required accountability. Jessica was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10. It was a lighter sentence than many had expected, but it reflected the complexity of the case. The court recognized that Jessica had been a victim in many ways, but she had also made choices that had led to two men losing their lives. As Jessica was led away in handcuffs, the weight of the verdict settled over the courtroom. The story that had captivated the town, the country, and even international headlines was finally coming to an end. But for those involved, the consequences of the Beckett family's downfall would linger for years to come. As the years passed, Jessica's story became something of a cautionary tale in Santander. People spoke of her with a mixture of sympathy and disdain. Some believed she had been a victim of circumstance, trapped in a toxic marriage and driven to desperation. Others believed she had orchestrated the deaths of both Oliver and Lucas, using her charm and intelligence to manipulate those around her. But for Jessica, the labels didn't matter anymore. She had accepted her fate, and in the quiet moments of her prison cell, she reflected on the choices that had led her here. She thought of Lucas, of the love they had shared, and of the tragedy that had followed. She thought of Oliver, the man who had promised her a new life, but had instead trapped her in a cage of lies. And she thought of herself, of the woman she had once been, and of the woman she had become. In the end, Jessica knew that she had been both a victim and a perpetrator. She had been controlled, manipulated, and abused. But she had also made decisions that had led to the deaths of 2 men. The trial had been the final reckoning, but the real consequences, the ones she would live with for the rest of her life, were far more personal.